Faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward of this faith is to see what you believe. St. Augustine, philosopher. Experience 2. Tasmanian Devil Man and the Yahyel. June 29th, 2021. Unknown to 7:30 a.m. Last night, after having been asleep for what felt like several hours, I rolled onto my right side and awoke slightly to the sound of a ringing in my right ear, the exact type of ringing that I felt just before the first experience. This seems to initiate the contact each time. Upon hearing the sound, I immediately began thinking to myself that the ringing was coming from my left ear, which Ra states in the Law of One as being a sign that negative entities are attempting contact. However, the ringing was not coming from my left ear. It was coming from my right ear, which Ra states as being indicative of service to others entities, aka positive entities. So at first, when I thought the ringing was coming from my left ear, I began thinking to myself and directing this thought towards them. I banish you. This is what Victoria and our trusted intuitive friend and Reiki master Lainey have advised me to do whenever I am contacted by negative entities as a first line of defense. After saying this, the ringing temporarily stopped, but upon realizing that this was actually happening in my right ear, my defenses were down and the ringing commenced. Once I allowed the ringing to continue, I drifted off into an unconscious state, only to be awoken sometime later to the feeling of an entity of some kind physically moving me around my bed. The specific way in which it was moving me around was such that I felt it grab hold of my tailbone, aka root chakra area, and pivot my whole entire body around so that my feet were now where my head originally was. I was still in a fetal position. At this point, I was aware that there was an entity in my room and that it was physically doing something to me. Once I was turned around with my feet facing the wall, it then pivoted my entire body upwards to a standing position, still using my tailbone as the axis by which it was rotating me. All this occurred in what I can only describe as a lucid dream or astral state, but much closer to a waking experience than any lucid dream I've ever had. It may be more accurate to say that it felt like a psychedelic or drunken state of consciousness. The moment I found myself standing upright, not standing on my own, but essentially being supported by the entity, I was immediately transported to another place. The transition was seamless, but slightly disorienting. This place resembled a very large white shopping mall type place, but there were no stores, no signs or written language of any kind anywhere, and lots of people walking around, busy with something. They all appeared to be human, but when I try to recall what any of them looked like, there is just a literal blur in my mind, or perhaps it had something to do with my vision. While I was walking around this bright white place, I remember having difficulty staying there. In other words, remaining in that dimension. This was much like a lucid dream, which requires a highly developed level of concentration in order to not wake up or drift back into dreaming. The same thing happened here, where I would lose the ability to remain in this place and find myself back in my bed. And as soon as I wound up back in my bed, I would feel them grab me by the tailbone and pivot my body in exactly the same way as before, until they were able to get me back to the correct state of consciousness to enable me to return to the bright white place. This happened about 3 times that I can remember. Each time it happened, I anticipated the entity grabbing me again, and cooperated, trusted that their intention was only to return me back to that place, to show me whatever it was they wanted me to see. I think I even tried to contort my body in what I thought was a helpful way to assist them in doing this. The third time I found myself in this bright white place, I was able to walk around, and I approached a sort of help desk looking structure in which two or maybe three human looking individuals, who all felt vaguely familiar, were waiting for me. Once I reached them, we began walking off to the right of the help desk and turned down a corridor which contained an elevator-like area. I asked them, "Can you show me what this place really looks like?" Assuming that what I was seeing was a projection of some kind. As soon as the words left my lips, all of the white walls immediately became a dark brown, wood-like material, and I realized we were actually in a much smaller space than this bright white mall had made me think. In this wooded area, there were doors and people sitting, working on something. I got the impression they were working on computers or something like computers. There was an orange door and a yellow door, completely flat with no decoration, just a solid color. I don't remember seeing any doorknobs or space underneath them. There were two black men about my age standing in front of two light gray metallic doors, perhaps guarding whatever was behind them. I felt intuitively that they were not actually human, but had chosen to appear this way in order to conceal their true form, and also prevent possibly startling or overwhelming me with whatever they really looked like. So far I hadn't seen any alien-looking beings in the whole place. Maybe they weren't doing it for my benefit, but for others like me who might not be able to handle it. Who knows? I asked one of these men if they could show me their ship, meaning spacecraft. I knew on some psychic level that this Matrix-like place they had brought me to was either on a spaceship or a space station, hence my question. They both turned to look at the door behind them, and they looked back at me and chuckled briefly before saying, no, not right now." This confirmed my suspicions, even though they wouldn't let me see anything. At that point, I either lost consciousness or there's a hole in my memory. What I remember experiencing next was that I woke in my bed to the feeling that there was someone in my room. I looked around and noticed that there was a human-looking woman shining a very small flashlight at me. This light was not blinding like a normal flashlight would be. It was quite dim, but still bright enough to illuminate the room so that I could see her. This was also not a fully awake state. I was in this drugged, possibly astral state. Once she realized that I was lucid enough to notice her, she walked over from the left side of the bed to the right side of the bed and knelt down so as to get closer, to say something to me. I could see her face clear as day. She was a middle-aged white woman with short, semi-wavy blonde hair, and she appeared to have a German, possibly Scandinavian complexion. I knew she was an ET, and I asked her, "Is this really what you look like?" And she replied, "No, I took this form so as not to startle you." I then assured her that it would be okay with me to change back to her true form, and I insisted she do it so that I could see. I was very curious. She said, "I'm about 9 feet tall, so just prepare yourself." And I said, "Okay." She then shapeshifted rather quickly into a very tall male being, with the right side of his body being a bronze color, and the left side of his body being what we would refer to as white skin tone. The remarkable thing was that this split tone was not down the middle, but diagonal, and it was not all pure skin, but there were areas of his chest that were diagonal stripes of fur. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and I could see that he had nipples like a human. His eyes had no pupils or irises. They were a solid silvery color, and he had tiny horns or antennae or small pointy ears on top of his head. Once he had finished shapeshifting, he informed me that his people evolved from Tasmanian devils. This was astounding to me, and I stared at him and analyzed his body up and down. I couldn't believe he said Tasmanian devils. I thought I was losing my mind for sure, but I'm certain that's what he said. You're probably thinking, oh, that's the thing that made you think you were losing your mind, but not all the other stuff? The answer is, well, yes. As far as I recall, this was all being spoken to me in plain English, when it was a woman and when it was the Tasmanian devil being. Months later, after the experience, I took out a tape measure to see how tall the room actually was that I was sleeping in at the time. It was 7 feet high. Therefore, this being could not have been standing in my actual room, but as I've come to realize, these visitations tend to occur in places that resemble my house but are not in the same dimension. I was sitting on the edge of my mattress on the floor, looking up at this being. Some time passed, maybe 20 minutes or an hour, since he shapeshifted and there was now a woman standing in his place. I don't know if he either shapeshifted again and I just don't remember, or if this was a completely different person altogether. She was a sort of East Asian-looking woman who was dressed almost exactly like Black Widow from the Marvel comics. She had some sort of jumpsuit on. It may not have been leather, I don't remember seeing reflections on it, but it was definitely a black jumpsuit of some kind. She was looking at something that looked like a laptop, but I think it was just a floating screen, thinner than paper, angled the way a laptop would be angled, and about the same size too. She wasn't looking at the screen, though. It was as if she had pulled it up to refer to it later, but wasn't actually looking at it. She was explaining to me, "We've been watching your profile for a while now. You used to lie a lot." I didn't even question what she said, even though, in retrospect, I feel like that was entirely untrue. But my response to her was, "Yeah, I think I used to use my imagination to fill in what I couldn't remember about what I know, but I try not to do that anymore." I began asking her a lot of questions about her people, but I cannot recall a single question now, much less her answers. I just remember being in the middle of asking her these questions when I abruptly snapped out of the whole experience, waking up in my bed sober as can be, like I'd never even been sleeping, just like last time. That same exact feeling of going from an altered state to immediate sobriety. I also want to mention that somewhere throughout this experience, there was another entity examining me, and I believe I was still in my bed when this was happening. It told me that the size and/or shape of my brain was the single most unique of all humans on Earth, or something ridiculous like that. It's a complete blur, but whatever it said, it definitely said something about the size or shape of my brain being unique. Afterthoughts. I reached out to Lainey about this one in order to get some insight, and after describing to her what I had seen, she mentioned that the woman in the black jumpsuit sounded very much like she belonged to an ET group known by experiencers and channelers as the Yahyel. I found an artist's rendering online of these beings and was struck by the similarity to the woman in my room. Much like the Greys, Pleiadians, etc., experiencers have managed to piece together a general consensus on what many of these ET groups visiting Earth look like, and these aggregate depictions of their physiology help us to identify them during experiences like mine. It is always very profoundly affirming and validating to me when I experience something I've never seen or heard about before, only to later discover that others have seen the exact same thing. As for the Tasmanian devil beings, that is not something anyone else has reported, as far as I know. One very interesting detail on this, however, was that stripe of white fur across the man's chest is actually something that Tasmanian devils have, and prior to the experience, I definitely did not know that. Did he know that I would research it and see that there was some truth to his appearance in order to gain my trust? Or was he just who he said he was? I think I find it hard to trust shapeshifters. You don't know who or what they really are, since they can appear as anything.